Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of Truth for Life, where we get to journey to freedom and healing. I'm Dr. Sandoval, and today we are going to be looking at the topic, sphere of action and healthy boundaries. This is going to be a challenging topic, a really good topic. We need to understand this topic. It plays into every relationship that you can think of. Now, what is sphere of action? Sphere of action are the actions of self-government for which the individual and no one else is responsible. Okay? So your self-government that is yours and no one else's. God's sphere of action includes everything that is outside of an individual's sphere of action. So God, He has control and responsibility in all of space and everywhere else. But you have your own individual sphere of action, and God does not take control and responsibility there. Inside of your self-government is where you have your own responsibility. You have your own, but because you belong to God, you have your own accountability to Him. Now, God takes no responsibility for what you do in your sphere of action. He takes no responsibility for that whatsoever. That is your own responsibility. Now, your sphere of action exists in your mind, and it doesn't extend beyond that. So, when it comes to your mind cannot be forced, but the body can be forced. You can be put in handcuffs. You can be put in prison. If you didn't want to eat, well, somebody can force feed you, or they can put an IV in and give you fluids and other things like that. The body can be forced, but the mind cannot. And when it comes to two individuals' sphere of action, I am not responsible for somebody else's sphere of action. I'm not responsible for their sphere of action. I'm only responsible for my sphere of action. What somebody else's sphere of action is it is what they think. It is what they believe. It is what they choose or decide. And out of that sphere of action comes what they say and what they do. But what they say and do does not remain in their sphere of action. It comes out of their sphere of action. And so now it gets into kind of general space, into God's sphere. And so God, He, of course, takes no responsibility for my sphere of action, and He takes no responsibility for your sphere of action. He only takes responsibility for His own sphere of action, which is outside of our sphere of action. Often, individuals will take ownership of a relationship. And when you take ownership of a relationship, what you do is you make yourself now responsible for the other person. Since a relationship involves two people, now you make yourself responsible for the other person. You take the other person's sphere of action as part of your own, and now you make yourself responsible for what they believe and what they think and what they say and what they do and how they respond. God never intended for you to take a relationship as your own responsibility, but He intended for you to be responsible in a relationship. And that means you take responsibility for your sphere of action, and you do that well, being responsible and accountable to God, and they are free in their side of the relationship with their sphere of action. And they have their own responsibility and their own accountability to God in that sphere. When you take ownership of a relationship, now you're trying to take responsibility for another sphere of action that even God doesn't take responsibility for. And you're stepping over boundaries that were never intended to be stepped over. So no, God never made you the owner of a relationship. He only made you a steward of the relationship, and a steward deals with my side of the relationship. It doesn't control somebody else's side of the relationship. And because I don't own the relationship, because it doesn't belong to me, I can never guarantee the outcome of a relationship. Because I can never guarantee the other individual and their own sphere of action. And indeed, that's how Jesus related with individuals. He was responsible with his own sphere of action, and he did not get into other people's spheres of action. Even Judas was with Jesus all of those years, and Judas finally betrayed Jesus. All of the disciples, well, for temporarily they betrayed him and ran away from him, deserted him. Jesus took no responsibility for what they did because that was their own responsibility, their own sphere of action. Even though he was in a relationship with them, he only took responsibility for his side and how he influenced and interacted with them. Now, there's a law of cause and effect, and that law of cause and effect assures us that every good cause produces a good effect, and every bad cause produces a bad effect. But in order to assure that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose, and that nothing will be too much for us, according to 1 Corinthians 10:13, then God must intervene for our good by limiting the negative effects. He must intervene for our good by limiting the negative effects. Now, everyone is free to self-govern within their own sphere of action. They are free to think, to believe, to choose, to trust, and so on for themselves. But no one is free to speak and act without intervention, or without the possibility of intervention, I should say. So what somebody thinks and what they believe, who they trust, what they choose, that is the cause. What they actually say and what they actually do, that is the effect. So God has no responsibility for the cause, and he never attempts to control the cause, but he does take responsibility for the law of cause and effect, and so he does control the effects, but he always does so for good. In my sphere of action, as long as I remain within my sphere and operating within my sphere, things are going to go okay, depending on how I operate my sphere. But the moment that I try to get out of my sphere and get into God's sphere and take care of what's in his sphere, well, now things are going to get interesting. Now I'm going to try to control time and space and circumstances, environment and resources and other types of things like that, and it's probably not going to go so well. And the moment I try to get out of my sphere and get into your sphere, well, that's not going to go well either. So the problems, many of the problems that we run into in our lives is simply us breaking out of our sphere and getting into somebody else's. Now, self-control is the ability to control your sphere of action. The moment you lose self-control, you will break out of your sphere of action, and you will attempt to get into God's, and you will attempt to get into others' sphere of action. And then you're going to be creating some mess along the way. Now, righteous self-government is like a normal cell. It stays within its sphere of action. Sinful self-government is like a cancerous cell. It tries to get outside of its sphere of action. And if I am a little God, then I try to control outside of my sphere. And selfishness has boundaries for itself, but selfishness does not have boundaries for others. In other words, I prevent individuals from getting into my space, but I freely will enter into theirs. And that's what selfishness does. So no, I don't like it when somebody tries to get into my sphere of action. I don't like it when people try to tell me what to do. I don't like it when they try to control my choices and my decisions and other things of that nature. But I'm sure willing to get into somebody else's and do that for them. And when I try to get into somebody else's sphere of action, the result is conflict. And when I try to get into God's sphere of action, the result is stress. So stress and conflict are the result of a lack of self-control and my attempt to get into somebody else's sphere of action. So while we have freedom to govern ourselves inside of our sphere of action, we were not created to be governed from outside. We were created to govern ourselves from inside. So the moment I try to get into your sphere of action, your natural response is to resist my intrusion. Right? That's your natural response because you were created to govern yourself. And to be free to govern yourself, you were not created to be controlled from the outside. And so the moment I try to get into your sphere of action, the result is going to be conflict. Conflict's the result of me getting out of my sphere and trying to get into your sphere. The reality is that I can actually not ever get into your sphere of action. And in fact, you can never get into my sphere of action either, but it sure looks like it. It sure feels like it. It sure seems like it. And the question is, why? What's going on? Well, if you have acceptance and approval that comes through you, and I think I need that acceptance and approval from you, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bind myself to you so that I can get that acceptance and I can get that approval from you. And in order to get that approval and that acceptance from you, I have to modify how I manage my sphere of action. In other words, I have to modify my thinking. I have to modify what I say. I have to modify what I do so that I can continue to get from you the acceptance and the approval and the harmony and the security and the other things that I need. And so while you cannot actually get into my sphere of action and control me, to me, it feels like you do. Because I'm changing what I think, I'm changing my self-government in relation to you, but I'm only doing so because of a lie that I believe, and the lie is that you control what I need. And because I believe you control what I need, now I will change how I govern myself in relation to you so that I can continue to receive from you what I think I need. So manipulation, somebody else can never actually manipulate you. You only manipulate yourself based upon a lie that you believe in relation to them. Isn't that crazy? It's crazy. So if I'm pressured by someone, then that means that I believe that they have something that I need, or they can take something from me that I need. They can do something to me that I don't want. So because I fear losing what I need, or I fear being forced to do what I don't want to do, then I feel pressured. I feel like I'm under pressure. But when you know that only God has and controls what you need, and that no one can do anything to you except by God's permission, and that anything that God permits is going to work out for good, then there's no pressure. There's no pressure. Now, what you think and what you believe is completely within your sphere of action. And that's your responsibility. That's your accountability. But what you say and what you do, that does, and I have, that comes out of your sphere of action, but it enters into common space. Now, if I try to take responsibility for what you think and what you believe, well, I'm outside of my sphere. And if I try to take accountability for what you say and what you do, I'm outside of my sphere. And once I take responsibility for what you say and what you do, now I'm going to have to try to control what you say and control what you do because I see it as my responsibility. And so again, conflict is going to be the result of this. And not only that, there's going to be damaged relationships because I'm taking you as my responsibility, and now I'm trying to take responsibility for what even God doesn't take responsibility for, and now I'm going to try to control. I'm going to try to manipulate. Right? Do we do this consciously? No. This is unconscious, but we're all doing it, and we're all doing it all the time. So I have a problem when it comes not just to people, but to other things around me, and there's space, and there's time, and there's circumstances, and resources, and environment, and people, and possessions, or all these different things. And they're like fires that are threatening to burn me. And here I am trying to control the environment. I'm trying to control possessions. I'm trying to control circumstances. I'm trying to control time because the clock is counting down. Right? I'm trying to control all of these different things so that I don't get burned. And I can't control what's outside of me. And so the result of trying to control what I cannot control is stress. And I have stress. Stress is trying to control what you cannot control and failing to do so. And it only comes because you think you're a God and you're trying to control what is only under God's control. Now, what you say and what you do, it doesn't stay in your sphere. It comes out of your sphere. And what you say and what you do can impact others and have an influence upon them. And it does have an influence upon them. And while you are not responsible, while I am not responsible, I should say, for what you say and what you do, yet if I'm a little God, then I will take possession of you, and I will take responsibility for what you say and do, and I will try to control you. And I will take personally what you say and what you do to me, because now I take responsibility for what you said and what you did. Isn't that wonderful? That's a mess. It's an absolute mess that we're in. Yeah. Now, even God doesn't take responsibility for what we do in our sphere of action. And he is not responsible there. That's our own self-government and our own responsibility. And God does not take personal what you and I do in our sphere of action. He doesn't take that personally. Even if we, throw it at him and throw it into his direction, he doesn't take it personally because he knows that's our sphere of action, that's our responsibility, but we do have an accountability to him. I'm not saying we don't have an accountability, but that's not his responsibility. But what about the stuff that gets into common space? That is God's responsibility. And how, if God doesn't have access to our sinful nature, he doesn't have access to our sphere of action, and the problem is inside of the sphere of action, and that's our own self-government, how's he going to fix the problem? Well, imagine one day that you were driving. I'm going to use an American context. You're in Alaska. Alaska is far north, if you don't know, and far north is cold. And you're driving around Alaska, and you're driving in a car, and Alaska is sparsely populated. You can drive for hundreds of miles and not see a person. And you're driving along, and all of a sudden your car goes... and it's not running anymore. And you happen to have broken down near a community of about 3 homes. And you check, and it happens to be that one of the individuals in one of the homes is an auto mechanic. But unfortunately, 2 summers ago, he ran into a grizzly bear, and he has no more arms. He has the know-how of a mechanic, but he doesn't have the ability of the mechanic. So, what are you going to do in order to work on the situation? Well, the mechanic has the knowledge of how to diagnose and to fix the problem, but you have the arms. So he will talk you through the process, but you do it. And it's by your hands and your arms and you're using the tools that you work on the car and you fix the problem, but it's by his knowledge that you're doing it. That's how God can help us to fix the problem. You might be saying, well, do you mean that God has no arms? Well, the problem is inside of our sphere of action, and he has no arms inside of our sphere. He can't just reach in and monkey around in there. That's our sphere of action. And so only we can fix the problem that's inside, but we don't know how, and we don't have the power. So he offers to guide us. He offers to empower us in the solution, but we are the ones that must do the work. Maybe you have heard or read somewhere that the expulsion of sin is the act of the soul itself. That's in the spirit of prophecy. The expulsion of sin is the act of the soul itself. That doesn't mean that you have the power to do it. It just means that it's inside your sphere and you're the only one that can get to it. And so that it must be by your work or your actions, but it needs to be by his knowledge and his power. So if you wait for him to do the work, it's not going to work. And if you rely upon yourself to fix it, it's not going to work. The only way that it's going to work is if you work together. God with the knowledge and God with the power and you with the effort to actually do the work. Now, when we have two individuals that are little gods and they are self-governing in a delusional way, then what you say and what you do, well, that's your responsibility, but what you say and what you do comes out into common space. And while God does not take responsibility for what you say, for what you're doing in your own sphere of action, he does take responsibility for what gets into the common sphere. And since what you say and do begins in your sphere, but it doesn't end there, God will intervene when it gets into the common sphere, which belongs to him. And he can prevent you from saying, and he can prevent you from doing certain things, but he will never prevent you from thinking it or from choosing it. That's your own responsibility. So fire operates by whose power? Well, God's power. And God's power alone that it can operate. But God's power is given to fire through laws, predictable laws. And while fire operates by God's laws, by God's power through his laws, yet he can limit that power when he so chooses, as was the case with Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. And God gives his power to animals. They operate by his power, but through laws. But God can limit the power that animals have access to, as was the case with Daniel in the lion's den. And people operate by God's power through predictable laws. But when God chooses, they have no access to that power, as was the case with King Jeroboam. When the prophet came and cursed his altar, and he said, "Arrest that man." And his arm shriveled up and he couldn't even bring his arm back to himself. Why? Because it wasn't his arm. It was God's. It wasn't his power. It was God's power. And it was in common space. That was not his sphere of action. His sphere of action was up in here. He already made the choice and God allowed him to had all the freedom to make the choice. But he didn't have the freedom to accomplish it. And bullets that move by God's power but under predictable laws. Well, they have power to do a lot of stuff. But unless God steps in and he says, no power for that. When I began my trauma surgery rotation at Loma Linda University, the team was still talking about an incident that had happened a few weeks before. Young lady had broken up with her boyfriend. He was not exactly happy about this arrangement, and he was going to get back at her. And so while she was parked at a red light, he came up to her and he shot her in the head through the driver's side window. And in America, it's the left side, and so the bullet came in here, and the bullet came out here. And you know there's some pretty precious real estate in between point A and point B. Well, she was picked up by the ambulance, rushed off to the medical center to Loma Linda, stabilizing her, trying to figure out what's going on. And of course, since it's a gunshot wound to the head, you need to get some imaging to find out what's going on. So neurosurgery knows how or if they're going to intervene anyhow. And so they rushed her off to the CAT scanner, and in the CAT scanner, you go in this small tube, and it's around you, and it starts spinning, spinning, spinning. Well, you don't see the spinning part, but and so you go through there, and it starts throwing X-ray beams at you from different angles, and then the computer puts the image together, and you get a nice image of what's going on. And as they're going through the scanner, it starts scanning at the top of the head. And so you get a slice here, and then you get a slice there, 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 and so on, and just kind of keeps slicing as you're going down. And so they were waiting to get to that critical area where they see the trauma that's going on. And when they got to the critical area, everybody's like, let's go back. Let's review. Let's look at that again. What's going on? The bullet came in here, which is the thinnest part of the skull. And it went to the skull, so through the soft tissues to the skull. And then it turned. And then it went back, and it went around, and it went around the back of the head, and it came around to this side, and poof, out the other side. It never touched her brain. Physically speaking, not possible. Physics does not work like that. And I assume, I don't know, but I assume that an angel was commissioned, and angels are pretty fast. And they were commissioned to not let the bullet go through, but to work it around. Why did she still have the in and out injury? God knows. Maybe it was so that the story could reach all the people in the hospital. But it was for good, not for evil. Right? But fire that burns only by God's power, but through predictable laws, has burned millions of martyrs to ashes. And animals that operate by the power of God, but under the will of the animal, through predictable laws, have killed many, many others. And arms that operate under the power of God, but the will of the man, have performed significant evil over time. And bullets that move by the power of God, but through predictable laws, have caused injury and damage to many, many people. And oftentimes we don't understand why God does what he does. We don't understand why he intervenes when he intervenes. We're like ants in the grass. We have a very limited perspective. We can only see just a little bit. And we just don't see the whole picture. But God sees the end from the beginning. He sees all time and space. He sees everything that's going on. And he is working in ways that are mysterious to us now, but we will understand later, so that he will work all things together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose, and that nothing, no temptation, no trial, no test, no suffering, or anything will overtake you. That others have been through it too. It's nothing that's uncommon to men. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted or tried or tortured or whatever beyond what you are able with the temptation or the trial or whatever it is, will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. So it's always, whatever it is that gets to us, it's always wrapped in the promise, it will work out for good, and it is not too much. We have at least that. Oh, it seems like too much. We think it's too much. But he knows better than we do. And while in the moment we don't know why, we can at least know who. And if you don't know why, at least come to the cross and look into the eyes of the one who hung there and look into those eyes and see what they tell you. And I tell you, you will see such love that was willing to suffer such torture and mental torture beyond, so much farther beyond the physical. Why? Because he loves you. And the same one who was willing to suffer and die for you is the same one who allows the difficulties and the painful things in your life, not for your evil, but for your good. And those things threaten to burn you up. And you are trying to control them. But God knows that there's a problem inside, and it's a problem of sinful nature. And if that problem is not fixed, you die. And he wants you. And so he surrounds you with his presence, and he filters what gets through so that it's never too much. The Father's presence encircled Christ, and nothing befell him but that which infinite love permitted for the blessing of the world. Here was his source of comfort, and it is for us. He who is imbued with the Spirit of Christ abides in Christ. The blow that is aimed at him falls upon the Savior who surrounds him with his presence. Whatever comes to him comes from Christ. He has no need to resist evil, for Christ is his defense. Nothing can touch him except by our Lord's permission, and all things that are permitted work together for good to them that love God. We're going to stay on this screen. All right, so what was Christ's source of comfort? It was his Father's encircling him. And what is our source of comfort? It's Christ surrounding us. And so the blow that is aimed at me, somebody going to punch me, it falls upon the Savior who surrounds me with his presence, and it cannot get through him unless he says, okay. Can't get through him unless he says, okay. And he feels it first. And he measures it. And he says, okay, is this going to work out for good, or is it not going to work out for good? And he will only allow it through if it will work out for good. And so I can take it as though it is coming from Christ because he's the one that filters it. Even though it might be coming from the enemy who's trying to destroy me by it. So while it may originate in the enemy who's trying to kill me, yes, yet it is filtered by the God who is trying to save me. And now I don't have to fear anymore. And he's seeking, I've got this metal that's misshapen and impure and so on, and I need that fire. That fire is needed in order to melt it, in order to purify it, in order to remold it. And so he is the refiner, and he surrounds me with his presence. And he works out the molding and the melting and the refining. And I can trust him in that. Now, what if let's take some specific examples. What if your spouse is a hoarder? Right? How do you handle a house where you have two individuals and a responsibility with shared space? So here you have a spouse that's a hoarder. I mean, they'd collect and collect and collect. Now the question is, who owns the house? Well, God does. And who are you accountable to? Your spouse or to God? Well, to God. And what are you accountable for? Well, you're accountable for how you relate to the house relative to its cleanliness and orderliness. Are you responsible for the outcome of the house? No, because you're not the only one in the house with responsibility. So we can ask the question, who has the delegated authority in relation to the house? If you are the clean one and let's say your husband is the dirty one and he's the one that's making the money and he's paying the payments on the house and he says, it's my house, okay, that's fine. If he takes possession of it, well, that's okay. And he takes responsibility of it, that's okay, all right. And then you can ask, well, what space do you want me to be responsible for? Do I get the kitchen, this half of the room, that bathroom, this room, and so on and so forth, and you're responsible for the other ones? Okay, that's fine. And what space are they responsible for? So if they're responsible for this room and this part of the house and that part of the house and so on and so forth, then you leave it as their responsibility. They're free to do whatever they want to with it. They're free to make it as dirty as they want to and so on. And what they do with their space is not your responsibility. That is their accountability to God, not to you. They're not accountable to you. They're accountable to God. And what you do with your space, that is your responsibility, and that is your accountability to God. And so you take that accountability and that responsibility, and you do your dishes, and you clean up your space, and you make sure that it's nice and well and orderly. And if theirs is a mess, well, maybe the contrast between the two might be something to help them to think about and consider what they're doing and how they're doing it in the future. I don't know, maybe. But even if they don't, that's not your responsibility. It's God's. And if the house ends up breaking down over time because of the dirtiness and the mess and all that kind of stuff that they have in their part of the house, okay, that's their accountability to God. So what are you accountable for? How you relate to the house or the final cleanliness and orderliness of the house? You're only responsible for how you relate to the house. You're not responsible for how it ultimately turns out, because that can be a lot to do with how they relate to the house. So is it ever good to try to take over someone else's stewardship, to enter into their sphere of action? No, that's not. So even if the intention is good, it's not right. Good intentions with bad actions is bad. Right? So you do your side, they do their side. You agree what that looks like, and you manage things from that standpoint. What if you have a secretive spouse? What if you have a spouse that has passwords and keeps secrets and doesn't share things with you and leads a fairly secretive life? They don't want you to access their email. They don't want you on their computer. They don't want you on your phone, on their phone, and so on and so forth. Is that a problem? Are they accountable to you? Does God know what's going on? Sure. Is secrecy a problem? Has God told us when he's going to come? No, it's a secret. God knows, but he hasn't told us. Is that a problem? No. What about surprises? Is it okay to keep a secret while you're working on a surprise birthday, a surprise something or other? Well, that's not a problem. So secrecy can be a problem, but it's not necessarily a problem. And secrecy can be a problem that manifests because of a lack of trust. It can be there because of a fear of rejection. And the question is, are you responsible for what someone else does? And the answer is no, you're not. If you try to take that responsibility, who are you? Well, you must be a god, right? And you're getting into someone else's sphere of action always leads to conflict. And so if you try to fix their secrecy by getting into their sphere of action, you are going to create conflict. You will. So they're free to be secretive. They're free to have those devices. They're free to have their passwords and all that kind of stuff. Now, if they have a problem and they acknowledge that they have a problem and they want to go free, and they're willing to be accountable and let you be part of the accountability, and so they want you to have the passwords and check on and so on and so forth, well, that's fine. You do so, but you do so knowing that they want you to. You don't go about snooping and sneaking and trying to find out and doing all of that kind of stuff. No, God will reveal, if it needs to be revealed, God will let it be revealed in time. Now, what about your reputation as opposed to your influence? What about that? Well, your influence is the impact that your words and your actions have upon others. And that comes from your sphere of action. Your reputation is what others think about you. And so that comes from their sphere of action, right? If it's what they think of you, then that's their sphere of action. So which are you responsible for? Are you responsible for your influence, or are you responsible for your reputation? You're only responsible for your own sphere of action, and your influence comes from your sphere of action, so you're only responsible for your influence. If your reputation is bad, is that your responsibility? Only if your influence was bad that they're now responding to and you have a bad reputation. But you don't have a responsibility for your reputation, your reputation, your reputation. You have a responsibility for your influence. Right? If your influence is bad, is that your responsibility? Absolutely. Yes, it is. So which do you need to guard and which do you need to control? Your reputation or your influence? Your influence. That is for you to guard, and that is for you to control. If you try to guard or control your reputation, are you inside of your sphere of action or are you outside of your sphere of action? Yeah, now you're outside of your sphere of action. And now there's going to be conflict. You're in conflict. I know individuals that have spent thousands of dollars. Lies had been told. Reputation of prominent individuals seemed to be, whatever. Websites developed in order to bring somebody's reputation down and so on. And then they spend thousands and thousands of dollars to get people to post and to post and post to get those websites with that information and get it and force it down farther and farther into the search field so that it won't be found by individuals and so on. Why? Doesn't matter. What others think, others will think. If you're trying to guard and control your reputation, who are you? Well, you're apparently a god. Now, what if you have a forgetful spouse? Right? Your spouse frequently forgets. Now, they don't have dementia. They just, they're not very exact in things. So to inform them when they don't know about something is okay, right? That's okay. But to keep reminding them is nagging. That's not okay. Right? Nagging is a form of control. It's an attempt to control another individual. So if you are nagging, you are out of your sphere and you are into somebody else's sphere, and it's going to result in conflict. Right? So if they're forgetful, they're allowed to be forgetful. Their accountability is to God. Their accountability is not to you. And you simply be faithful to remember the things that you need to remember. And if they don't take care of their deal and their side of things and so on, yes, you're going to get to experience some of the consequences with them and some of the effects of that. But if you love them, you're willing to do so, and God will work it out, and He'll make sure that it works out for good in the end to those who love God. So if I take responsibility or if I try to force another in regards to their sphere of action, then, well, it's not going to go over well. And in fact, I really cannot force them. All I can do is appeal to them. Right? I can only appeal to them in regards to what they say and do. And if they are self-destructive, they have self-destructive thoughts and beliefs and so on in their situation, well, I still don't try to force them. I simply try to appeal to them. And I take from God, and I seek to give to them what I have taken from God. And I have a heart of love for them in order for them to be free. And I try to reason with them if they're open. If they're closed and they shut me out, well, that's fine. I don't force it. I don't push it. But if there's an opportunity, I try to appeal to them. I try to reason with them. And if they, in their self-destructive self-government, they still can't see it, then it might be beneficial to get a few others that have hearts of love for the individual and to come together in order to reason with them and to appeal to them in relation to their self-destructive situation. And if they're still resistant to that, then surround them with as many people as you can that have a heart of love for them to seek to try to encourage them and reason with them and appeal to them to come out of their self-destructive behavior. And if they won't, well, you treat them like a sinner. And how do you treat sinners? With open arms and love. They might not have church positions anymore, that they're, whatever, but you love them and you surround them. Right? Many claim that a position of trust in the church gives them authority to dictate what other men shall believe and what they shall do. This claim God does not sanction. The Savior declares, all ye are brethren. All right, so here are some thoughts on sphere of action, but we need to dive into the topic of healthy boundaries in the time that we have left. So what about healthy boundaries? How do we understand healthy boundaries? Well, I'll tell you this, we don't understand healthy boundaries. We just don't. We're a mess. We're really a mess. So healthy boundaries are necessary for proper function and for relationships. It's proper and it's appropriate. We have to have healthy boundaries. And what healthy boundaries do is they keep others out of your sphere of action and it keeps you out of others' sphere of action. And let me modify that statement. I'm going to modify it. A healthy boundary can only be activated by myself in relation to myself. That's it. A healthy boundary can only ever be activated by myself in regards to myself. And so a healthy boundary keeps me out of your sphere of action. That's what it does. It keeps me out of your sphere of action. Now you cannot force your way into my sphere of action. And when I know that, and when I'm a child of God, when I have God as my source, and I know that you can't get into my sphere of action, you can try all you want to. There's no need for a boundary for me to erect because it's already there. It's erected by the truth. But a healthy boundary keeps me out of your sphere of action. And a healthy boundary keeps me out of God's sphere of action. Now, what you do as far as boundaries are concerned is in relation to what you perceive. So here you have a big kitty, right? See that nice big kitty on the other side of the fence? So boundaries are automatic, and boundaries are based upon perception. If you perceive danger, you can't help but put up a boundary to protect yourself. If you see the big lion coming towards you and there's no fence between you and the lion, you can't help but put up some kind of boundary to try to protect yourself, whether that boundary is space or whether that boundary is something, you can't help it. If you perceive that there is no danger, then there is no need for the boundary. If that is your lion that you have raised and it knows you and loves you and you get to play with each other, then there's no boundary that's needed. And if you are already protected because there is a boundary that is up already, then you have no need for your own boundary, like in this case where there's the fence already between you and the lion. No need for your own boundary in that case. So, false perceptions lead us in breaking boundaries. So I try to enter God's sphere, or I try to get into somebody else's sphere of action, and I try to keep others out of my sphere of action, but I freely enter into their sphere. And I break down appropriate boundaries because of this false impression, this false perception that I am a God. Now, if the boundaries are to protect myself, then they will always end up being harmful. Always. And people are like, huh, what? Hang on. Isn't that what boundaries are for? No. Healthy boundaries are to protect you from me. It's not to protect me from you. It's to keep me from getting into your sphere. Right? That's what boundaries are for. And if I think I'm putting up a boundary to protect me from you, then I think that I am my own. And now, right? Now that's selfish. Right? The motivation is selfish. And I don't care how good the thing looks like that you do. If it's selfish, it's not good. And it's not going to work out well. Selfishness never turns out well in the end, even though it might seem good at the time. So if I am putting up boundaries that are for myself, to protect myself because I think I am my own, i.e. I am God, now I'm doing it from a selfish motive, and selfish motives will always be destructive. And the question is, are you your own? And the answer is no, you're not. So you can never do something for yourself because you're not your own. You belong to God. And so a boundary is appropriate in relation to God's will for your life, but a boundary is never appropriate for you yourself. It's only appropriate as you belong to God. So Jesus had a mission given to him by his Father, and that he did have boundaries to protect that mission. He did. In Luke 2:49 says, "Why did you seek me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" Jesus was now confronted by his mother and his parents. They had lost him for 3 days. They found him back in the sanctuary, in the temple, and he had been teaching and so on. And now they reprimand him, and he says, hang on, wait. No, I must be about my Father's business. You don't have the right to control my ministry. That belongs to the Father, not to you. But he did so in a very respectful way, not harsh and anything like that, but it was very firm. In John 7:6-8 says, Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it that its works are evil. You go up to this feast. I am not yet going up to the feast, for my time has not yet fully come." His brothers were saying, if anybody's anybody, you go to Jerusalem and you show yourself there, and you show yourself whether you are somebody or not. Go. And Jesus said, it's not my time. It's not for you to direct my ministry. It's for the Father. And so his boundaries kept him inside of his Father's will. Matthew 12:48-50, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And he stretched out his hand toward his disciples and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my mother and brother and sister." Yeah, he notice that it's very clear he's putting up boundaries multiple times, and almost always it's with family. It's almost always in family, because family feel like they have the right to intervene and get in there and say, okay, well, your ministry should look like this, and your ministry should look like that, and your ministry should look like this. And he's saying, no, you have no right to determine what my ministry should look like. That's the Father's business, not yours. But he did so in a very respectful way. So you belong to God. You don't belong to yourself. You have no right to allow others to divert you from God's will and his plan for your life. You don't. You belong to him, not them. And in Christ, you will have boundaries to protect God's will and his plan for your life. But it will always be with the utmost respect and gentle firmness. But Jesus never put up any boundaries to protect himself. It was only for the mission. He knew his Father had already set up a boundary for him, so he had no need for a boundary for himself. So in John 18:12, then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. No boundaries for himself. John 18:11, "Shall I not drink this cup which my Father has given me?" He knew it came from his Father. "Do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus?" He knew that this was from his Father. It was within the boundaries of his Father, and so he didn't put up his own boundaries. They spat on his face. No boundaries for himself. They beat him. no boundaries for himself. Others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you?" No boundaries for himself. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. No boundaries for himself. When they had twisted the crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they spat on him. No boundaries for himself. They took the reed and struck him on the head. No boundaries for himself. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" And Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me, unless it had been given to you from above." He was within the confines of the boundaries of his Father, and when he was in his Father's boundaries, he had no need for boundaries for himself. John 19:18, they crucified him. He had no boundaries. No boundaries for himself. You and I are surrounded with all of these different things. But when we understand that Jesus surrounds us with his presence, and he is the one that filters what gets through, then you and I will have no boundaries for ourselves. Yes, we will have a boundary for God's will and his purpose for our lives. And no, we will not allow others to divert us from that purpose. But when it comes to self, we need no boundaries for ourselves because we are in Christ's boundaries. And he decides what gets through. And everything that he lets through will work out for good. And it will not be too much. But it sure doesn't feel good. And it sure feels like it's too much. But he knows what he's doing, and he will work it out in his time and his way. And at the end, we will look back on it and go, "Oh, what marvelous things God has done." When we get to the ability in heaven to see the end from the beginning, we will agree with him, with what he has allowed and what he has done in our lives. We will agree. And here and now, we get to enjoy or learn how to enjoy staying within our sphere of action, self-control, and having proper boundaries that protect God's work in our lives, but never to protect ourselves, but simply for his good and his glory.